This is Breach of Chthonia podcast, and this is my Monday live stream here on Instagram. If you watch this in playback, if you are watching this afterwards, after it's been recorded, if you're not actually here to see it, or if you want to go back and review what you've missed, if you pop in later on, do hit this a second time in posts so that it opens up in Reels, because then you'll be able to see the whole live stream if you're looking for the whole thing. In posts, sometimes it plays the whole thing, sometimes it cuts it off, so you can watch it there. You also have the option, I always download these, and on Tuesdays, sometimes Wednesdays, but usually Tuesdays, I will go and I will upload these to YouTube on the Chthonia YouTube channel. So either place, I will have this recording will be available there. So welcome. For those of you who are, I have one person who joined so far, Fractor273, thank you very much. And usually more people will trickle in as we go on. Now, this particular podcast, I'm calling it a podcast because I just released one today. This live stream is going to be talking about the subject of dark work. Okay, that is the way, as opposed to light work. And I'm going to explain to you why that's the theme of today and where that came from. Just a very quick Chthonia update. Right now, I have a few things that are going on. I've talked about the Dark Feminine app, which I am now affiliated with, and I have information about that here on Instagram, and also I can also post it in the description to this particular video. But I have affiliation with them. They're a really great resource for everything related to the Divine Feminine, actually. I don't know if I said the Dark Feminine app, Divine Feminine app. And they also have my material here, my books, and other things as well are listed there, as well as a lot of other resources on the Divine Feminine in all of its forms, as well as events, classes, sacred circles, and places like that, and things like that are also available there. I'm also doing an interview tomorrow with Mystic Mag, which I think is it's more for spiritual coaches and things, and that's going to be something that appears on my other channel, which is called Transition Life Coaching, and will also be featured on my other website connected to that, rather than on Chthonia. Although if there are people on Chthonia who are interested in the interview and what I have to say there, then I will certainly post a link to that here and on my other social media as well. And currently, I think as I've mentioned to people, I've got some of the books that I was working on while I was in Oxford over Christmas break, that I'm going to be now looking at doing the artwork for and trying to get published through Chthonia Books, as well as now trying to work on an idea of a kind of open university with some, what we're going to call degree programs. I mean, they're obviously not certified in the way that a college degree is, but there's this idea of kind of open universities or open colleges to discuss certain subjects and bringing in certain lecturers. I have a whole string of lecturers I've talked to about potentially doing something like this, all of whom are credentialed people, everybody with PhDs in various fields or expertise in various areas of esotericism. So I'm going to see about putting it together. I don't know that I can do it totally for free, but I'm hoping it's something I can do at low cost. If there's enough people and anything, trying to work this into the school that I already have. Because I like the idea of having something, some kind of an educational track that's available to everybody. So anyway, that's all that's in the works right now in Chthonia. This week's podcast is on Hildegard of Bingen, who is a polymath, and really, really quite remarkable. I mean, I know I'd read about her in the past, but when I was researching her for the podcast, I really found her to be quite an interesting figure. So that podcast is out today, both on Spreaker, should be on podcast apps soon. I usually have a limited access link for patrons only, and then the next day I actually open it up to everybody. Plus, that's also on YouTube in a version as well. If you use a podcast app like iTunes or Google Play or any of these others, if it's not available yet, it should be really, really soon. So, yeah. So anyway, that's the updates out of the way. So let me talk a bit about what I mean, how the subject came up, first of all, of dark work. Now, dark work is, I put it in contrast to light work or light workers. That is a term that is frequently used for people who are in spiritual practice. And it's a term that I hear quite a lot. The part of the work that I've done, because we all do different things. I have what I do in my teaching and I guess the pedagogical component of what I do. And then there's also what I do individually one-on-one. And that is classed as spiritual coaching, even though it's not a word I'm entirely comfortable with. For anybody who follows this podcast for any length of time knows the difficulty I have with the idea of spirit per se, simply because it has a lot to do with transcendence. And this is a podcast, and this is also a whole venture that is about the Chthonia. So it has to do with the earth, what's under the earth, the underworld. It's more about accessing the underworld and not about transcending the world. So that's why I'm not that fond of the term spirit. But from a broader marketing technicals perspective, that's what it's known as. So I think this interview that I'm doing tomorrow with this one group is one component of maybe what spurred this topic. But also, I do have another channel that I kind of have two parallel things going on. I do have a channel where I do readings every week, and right now I've kind of split them up half and half. I do half the signs one week, half the signs another week. And I had a woman comment on there. It was one of the cards that I had used. It was in the Murray Hope's Cartouche deck, which is Egyptian. It has all Egyptian symbolism. And the card that I held up was called the card of the god Ptah. And it shows the Masonic symbol on it. It has the kind of compass and the other. It's got that, it's the symbol. It's a very familiar symbol. It's often connected with Freemasonry as well. And I might have mentioned that offhandedly in one of the readings when I was talking about the meaning of the card. And this woman said, "Well, why are there Masonic symbols on the cards? Is this a satanic channel? Is this a satanic system or channel or something? I can't be involved in things that are satanic." And I just thought, okay, I think I posted a very short reply to that on my other channel, but I was like, I don't really even know how to reply to that. Because I think there's a lot of people who work in the realm that I do who would be inclined to say, "Oh no, I'm not satanic. No, I'm good. I'm operating on the God side of the good. I'm a light worker. I'm a light worker. This is not, you'll find that too. You find that too with people who, for instance, first get involved in witchcraft practice. They'll say, "Oh no, I'm a good witch. I'm all about just nature and trees, and I don't have any of this other stuff." And the thing is, the more that you get involved in things, the more you realize that this is not a thing of like, am I a light worker versus am I some other type of magician. Like there's this battle between good wizards and bad wizards and stuff like that. It gets to be kind of silly the longer that you get into practice, because you realize that the distinctions are really not that. There's not such a strong dividing line between the two. If you are serious about practice, if you are serious about that as a spiritual path, you will find that things that initially you might get into in a very lighter, I think the term in the community is fluffy kind of a way, then you will eventually, if you are serious, then you will hit all the pitfalls, you will hit all the brick walls. You will have all those places where you say, "Oh my goodness, I appealed to this god or this goddess, and I thought they were going to come in and sort of champion me, and instead my entire life fell apart." And it's kind of like, well, yeah, that is kind of what happens, or what could happen. I can't say, you can't guarantee what's going to happen to anybody in any of these circumstances, but a lot of times these dark gods are not your buddies. I mean, it's not that they're not necessarily your enemies either, but they're not there to be a fairy godmother that waves a wand and makes your life perfect. That's not how any of that works. And so I think all of these things got me thinking about, okay, well, and also just trying to formulate for people what it is that I do, because it's not always an easy thing to talk about with people, because people have these categories kind of preset in their heads already about, who's working on the side of good and who's working on the side of the devil or Satan or whatever. And of course, my definition of the word satanic, which is not the definition that most people have. A lot of people think of what is satanic as what has to do with something that's ultimately evil, right? It has to do with demons and all this kind of stuff. And of course, the word demon itself is problematic from that standpoint as well. When people don't like it when I tell them that angels and devils basically are the same type of thing. They just live in theoretically live in different areas, but they're not necessarily that different. They may be different in how they approach you if you do rituals and how you're going to encounter those types of beings and what kind of information they may or may not give or how they behave. But typically speaking, you're not talking about this. There's not. I don't see a real strong distinction between them, except like kind of where they are, so to speak. Assuming that they're, because again, you can't talk about it in terms of place really either. But when we talk about what is satanic, you are talking about, well, okay, first of all, if you're talking about the biblical idea of satanic, the biblical idea is more of an adversarial role. It's more of somebody who is a particular angel who acts in a role of a tester or someone who challenges. Satan is more of a role than a person. It's only as you start to develop ideas about Yahweh that are monotheistic, because originally Judaism, as I've mentioned, is henotheistic, where they worship a lot of different gods, including a lot of the Canaanite pantheon was definitely part of Judaic practice. I talk about this in my podcasts on Asherah, for instance, and then what was the other one? I'm not remembering at the moment. In any case, I do have a couple of them on the Canaanite deities. And if you look at those, I go into great detail about this as well, and I also refer people to some other sources on this. But the idea of Satan, like the Satan we see in the book of Job, for example, that is a figure who is, and it's an interesting book for people because they have a hard time understanding, where you have Job, who is this upright citizen who follows the law and does everything Yahweh wants, and so Yahweh's talking to Satan, or the figure who's acting in this role, and says, "Oh, there's my servant Job, and he's great. He's never gonna, he's a perfect example of what I want." And Satan says, "Oh, I'll bet I can make him curse your name." And he's like, "Oh no, I'll bet you can't." And so it's kind of like, okay, well, you're on. It's a bet. And so this Satan comes in and proceeds to completely destroy Job's life and everything that he has. And so people assume, of course, that he's done something bad to offend God, and he doesn't know what the heck is going on. He's just kind of part of his bet. And eventually he finally kind of goes, can you explain to me why this is happening? And of course you're always like, shut your face. I'm more powerful than you. I can squish you like a bug. You don't question what I do. Okay, this is a really hard book, and you'll see a lot of theologians try to play around with this book and explain about the mystery of God's ways and things like that. But the bottom line is that book is a bit troublesome because it basically implies the fact that because you always have to struggle if you're dealing with a monotheistic religious system, you always have to deal with the fact that that the God of that system does not always behave in ways that are good. And so it's the question that was posited by, probably not only by David Hume, but certainly most famously by David Hume, the rationalist philosopher, where he says, if God is all good, okay, and all powerful, then why is there evil? Okay, why is there evil in the world? So it implies either that God is not able to stop evil from coming into the world, in which case God is not all powerful, or that he is and he just doesn't, in which case he's not all good. And then there's all these different theodicies that try to explain why. They say, oh no, it's just God's all good, but people have free will, and and there's all these different arguments about that, right? But anyway, that's one sense of the term Satan. You also, in a more esoteric sense, Satan has a lot to do with the way has to do with incarnation, has to do with the fact that you take spirit and you bring it into matter. When people talk about the reverse pentagram, okay, there's the idea, it's the idea that something that is from the realm of spirit is being directed downward into this realm, okay, into the earthly realm. And so it certainly within certain heresies, like we often hear about the Albigensian heresy, sometimes called the Cathar heresy. Now, I did a podcast with Dan Hanley where he tries to explain the Cathars are not quite the Cathars, or at least they're not the way that they're portrayed. And again, so I would direct people to that in the Chthonia conversation series that I have, where we spoke about that at length. But nonetheless, there's still this idea of this heresy that says that basically all incarnation is evil. So, for example, having a child would be considered an act of evil because you're taking spirit and you're sort of encasing it in flesh. You're bringing it into this fleshly thing. And of course, the church says, well, you can't have that because then you'd have no people. So, that's a heresy. And then, so it's really, so there's also that component of the idea of what is satanic. It's sort of that bridge point between what's material and what's spiritual, or what is being brought into the realm of the material. Okay, which is not evil in and of itself. It's just you're here, and it it can be good or can be whatever. There's also the idea of satanic as having to do with what is rebellious or what is in rebellion. It is often when you think of the stories from like Paradise Lost, for instance, your John Milton, it describes this idea of the fall of Lucifer, and again, the fall of Lucifer is interesting because, first of all, that's not really a biblical story. There is a passage that talks about Lucifer falling, but as Peter Gray explains in his book Lucifer Princeps, which is a really, really good book from Scarlet Imprint, he alludes to the fact that this has more to do with the Babylonian king, or reference to, rather than the idea of some angelic figure that's falling down. But this is the way that this has been taken in and understood, and it's basically it's almost de facto the context that people will use that for in Western culture. I caught something the other day, just when I was taking a break and kind of flipping around through YouTube. It was a History Channel thing on exorcism that had popped up, and I'm looking at it, and of course, they have the people in there, and they're trying, and it's amazing to me. It really kind of brings home to me just how unhistorical History Channel is, because they were getting into all these things about about what their definition of the demonic, and it would or the ancient Babylonian ideas of the demonic, which really have a lot to do with disease and the way that disease comes into the world. Seeing these as forces that may attack us or be against us in some way, or may cause death. But when you use the term daemon is originally a Greek word for intermediary. And that's any kind of being that kind of mediates between you and what we might think of as the divine realm, or as the realm of something that is other than ourselves. And you also think of demonic forces as being in nature. A lot of times they'll be referred to that way as well. But again, these are not forces of evil. They're not necessarily good or evil. They're just forces. They may be acting as messengers. They may just be the types of spirits that you work with and appease in certain ways that you are negotiating, that we are really very alienated from now. So when I use that term, because usually when people say that to me, I'm just like, well, if you're talking about an ultimate evil, then no, really. And also, I kind of also wondered with the same person who I was talking about initially, this just for those who are joining recently, I had somebody on my other channel, where I do readings. They're separate from Chthonia, where somebody said to me, one of the symbolisms on the cards, and like I said, it was like the Masonic symbol, and they were like, oh, does that mean that is this satanic? Is this stuff satanic? And it's like, why are you watching a tarot channel if you're concerned about that kind of symbolism? I'm like, maybe that's not for you. maybe you don't want to deal in tarot because tarot is filled with esoteric symbolism. Okay. All of it is, but if you're thinking that this is all if you're watching too many of those reality TV shows or those paranormal shows that they have, the haunting or things like that, where they have the idea of so and so bought a deck of tarot cards and the next thing I know she was possessed by the devil, stupid stuff like that. And as it's been pointed out to me, I was having a conversation with Jesse Pollock about this, who does podcast 1289, Unknown Horizons, and True Crime Movie Club. 1289 Productions does all this, and does films and stuff. And they're a bunch of at least he's from New Jersey, and some other ones. So, and we've sort of had the weird New Jersey thing in common, because I've published he's done more publishing with them than I have, but I have done a couple things for them. And so he was pointing out to me that those particular TV shows are all produced by a evangelical broadcasting company. They have evangelical or fundamentalist ties. So, and that's why I've often said to people, when you watch shows like this, even things that purport to be very scientific in nature, find out, who's producing this show. Like, what's the agenda of the production company of this show? Because on a show like that, their whole goal is to show you dealing with anything in that realm is demonic or it's evil. And they are promoting a particular worldview. So you want to, you can still watch them and enjoy them or whatever, but just be aware that that's what it is. People, and my experience with those shows also is that a lot of them are not, and maybe people already know this, but I think a lot of people, they come across as very, very convincing in the way that they tell these narratives, but you will find that if you know anything about the original story, I can give one example of that was on Paranormal Witness. There was a story called Through the Eyes of a Killer. And it's basically about a psychic who was able to help police track down a serial killer in New Jersey. Now, I know this case because the serial killer lived 2 houses down from my grandmother. It was my house, my grandmother's house, our other neighbors, and then 2 other neighbors. Well, actually, no, there was another neighbor there, and then this was the house on the corner. Now, he wasn't living there at the time that this all happened, but he had been part of that. And I remember when it all happened because it was at it was called the Morris County Mall. Now I think it's called Cedar Knolls Plaza or something, because the mall was really a stretch of a term. I guess it was a place where you could walk inside and there were stores, but it wasn't very big. And I remember this show was kind of representing that this psychic was able to pick out where the car had been parked. Oh my God, this huge parking lot. I'm like, it's not a huge parking lot. I could drive on the road it's on from one end of the parking lot to the other if I have no cars in front of me in literally 30 seconds. It is not a big parking lot. Okay. And if you read anything in the papers about the girl, this was a girl who was abducted from there, and then they found her murdered, and and then there was another murder. It was like, yeah, you could get, I could have told you, at 8 years old, I could have told you where the car was parked. It's like, because obviously if she was working in this store, then she would have parked here. It's just, that's just a very small example, but they were showing like this big parking deck. I'm like, and the police officer was like, oh, that's a big parking. I'm like, in what universe is that a big parking lot? So anyway, that's just a small dumb thing. And I also happen to know the psychic who was on the case, who, I think is a legit psychic. I have some mixed feelings about her that I won't talk about here, but in any case, there's some elements of truth, and there's some stuff that's just kind of like, but they're putting that forth as evidence of how great she is as a psychic. I'm like, well, no, it's not. So, and there were just some other things, but I don't want to digress into that. But just to say that, and I've seen other, in fact, I think podcast 1289 had covered one of these cases by idea of this werewolf in Ohio or something, and the people were writing in going, what the heck are they even talking about? Like, these people don't even live here. Like, this isn't even a thing, or what they're talking about, this doesn't exist. And so, so you have to be really careful with stuff like that. But a lot of people do get very, it plays into people's fears about that kind of stuff, about their ideas about dark and light. And so that's why you always really have to kind of be aware of what the source is of what you're doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree or disagree with the source in terms of what their principles are, but in a lot of cases like that, they are trying to promote a particular worldview. So working in the kind of area that I do, there's a lot of people who I work with, who are great people, by the way, but a lot of them come for themselves as light workers. Or I've been in groups where they'll be like, oh, well, you're a light worker. And I'm like, no, I'm not a light worker, I'm a dark worker. I don't work because, and I want to really explain what I mean by that, because it's really quite relevant to what I'm doing with Chthonia, and also with the business that I call Transition Life Coaching, which is about how we, how you deal with certain types of changes and how you deal with certain types of crises. Because my work is in crisis work, it's in death work. Okay, so it's about when you are going through that kind of a change. Now, there's people who are not going through that who also are clients of mine, and like to when they have things going on, work with me, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be, but that's really what I specialize in. So, what does that mean exactly? So, okay, I have a channel like this where I'm talking to you now, right? I do podcasts, I do teaching, I do writing, but really, when it gets to that level of work, it has less to do with illuminating, okay? Because when you're working in dark spaces, okay, we're using some metaphor here. We're not dealing with, it's not exactly that you're trying to illuminate it. You are a little bit. I like to give the analogy of deep sea. If you ever watch those programs where they send like a camera down to areas where human beings would probably be crushed by the pressure, and they'll send a camera down and you see all this weird looking wildlife living in these deep, dark parts of the ocean, or some other kind of body of water, but where it's something that's really, really deep, where it would be probably dangerous for a human to go down there. And you see all these weird kinds of fish and things down there that have there's one, I forget what it's called. I always forget what the name of this fish is, and I've seen the name a zillion times, but it just doesn't stick in my memory. There's one, it almost looks like, they have bioluminescence for one thing, okay? So they have this kind of phosphorus glow that kind of breaks up the absolute blackness of that space. One of them seemed to have looked like a little headlamp built in, and I forget. But they're the fish with the really big jaws too. They're really, really scary looking. I don't think I'd want to encounter something like that. But they're adapted to their environment. They're adapted to the dark, because when you're in the dark and you can't see, it's like there's certain things you need more of to be able to see where you're going and what you're doing. So what is the dark for us? Well, the dark really, this is also why I'm so interested in why you see the word liminal bandied about everywhere that I work. Because it's a term that I like, because it has to do with being on the threshold of something. It's usually a space that is neither here nor there. Okay, it's you're in a transition where you are not who you were before, and you still don't know where you're going or what you're going to be. So you're kind of, it's like Schrodinger's person, it's like you're that and you're not that at the same time. Okay? And this is a really uneasy space for people to be in, because when you know you are about to lose something, when you're about to face up to a death or a loss, okay, you may be able to mentally prepare for that to some degree. You may feel like you may have some level of mental preparation that where and even so, like say if you're losing a beloved pet or a beloved family member or a beloved, it still doesn't matter. When the loss comes, there's the grief that accompanies the loss. Okay. But if you have a situation, say with somebody who's been suffering for a really long time, that loss can actually come as a relief. A lot of times the suffering, the ending of that suffering is a moment of relief, because now it's like, okay, this long drawn out process of when is the suffering going to end? Okay, it's done. But now that it's done, now you have this void. You have this gap. You have this place. And it's a place, like now if it's a death of somebody or like I said, a person, a pet, whatever, then there's the void of what was there and is not there anymore. And if this person was part of your regular life, this naturally is going to change your life and who you are, and not just your daily routines. It does change you in some way, depending on how profound the relationship is. And so that's one kind of loss, but there's other kinds of transitions like that as well. You could be somebody who's an adult moving out of your parents' house for the first time, right? You could be now going to a place where you're going to be living with other people, maybe people you don't know. And now you have to get on and try to figure it out. Or maybe you're just picking up and moving in general. Or people who have children. And it's like, okay, now you've got this extra person that's part of your life. Now that changes who you are and what your life's going to be also. There's all these kinds of changes. And we kind of end up falling into this in-between state. A lot of work that has been written on this kind of liminal state generally comes from anthropology and often refers to initiation. Okay, it refers to... they'll be spoken about in terms of tribal initiations or something like that, and the idea of this kind of uncanny place that's between where the initiate is, again, their identity of who they were has been stripped away, and they're going through this process to become the new person that they're going to be. But anybody who's undertaken any kind of formal initiation will know that the actual initiation ceremony and its drama and what's associated with it. If you're doing an initiation that is meaningful and not just simply, somebody says a bunch of words and it's symbolic and boom, it's something that's a little more profound than that has an ordeal or that has something that goes along with it. You know that when you finish that initiation, the work is really just beginning. It's a new spot. You're in a new space, and now you're negotiating a whole lot of stuff. And some of those changes are easier than others. Sometimes you have a change like that and a lot of things open up for you. Other times you walk out of that and everything falls apart and you're struggling. So, and you never know. And you never know how that's going to play out. So if I go back kind of to this deep sea thing, you've got this kind of, I talk about the idea of bioluminescence, but there's also, you will find that creatures who live in the dark have senses that are a little bit beyond that. They have senses that are, they may, for example, have a heightened sense of touch or feel. Like they may be able to kind of feel things that are around them, without actually seeing them. They might have a strong sense of smell. They might have, they have some other kind of adaptation, some kind of sensory adaptation that allows them to be aware so that and again, at the most basic level, this would be for survival, right? Being able to avoid being eaten or being able to find food or whatever. That's at the most basic level. But similarly in humans, we have senses. We have ostensibly 5. Okay, we've got, it's sight, taste, smell, touch, and hearing. Okay, those are the 5 senses. And then we may have other intuitive kind of faculties that we have as well. Now, the one that we privilege is sight. Okay, sight is the one that we privilege. Seeing is believing, right? What I can see with my eyes is what there is. So we talk about shining a light on something. We want to be able to see it. Okay, because when I can see it, then I can analyze. Then that's when the mind gets involved. Okay, now I'm going to analyze it and dissect it. Now, of course, the mind does work on autopilot for certain things. If it didn't, you'd have to analyze everything every day when you got up. So there is a certain unconscious amount of analysis that goes on, or interpretation or perception of a situation where you see something and your mind has already has an imprint or made a decision about what that thing is that you're encountering. But when you're dealing with things where it is not something you're familiar with, I mean, of course, the first thing your mind does when it sees something unfamiliar is to say, oh, okay, what is that like? Okay, we start looking for something to compare it to, something in our past experience to compare it to, which we can't always do. Or our past experience may not be accurate for what's going on in the present. So we have to, a lot of times we have other senses. We have other ways of connecting us to the natural world, just like animals do. But we don't use them. There's a book I talked about that my friend Ellen had lent to me back when I was in England over the break, and it's called The Black Goddess and the Sixth Sense. And I would love to recommend this book to people, but it is so hard to find. When I've seen it up on like 8 books or whatever, it's usually like $200 plus just for a paperback copy, because it's so hard to find. And she was lucky enough to pick it up for like like £2 or something in a charity shop. So when she mentioned the book to me in a message, and I said to her, and I looked it up, I'm like, oh, that's what I said. Hang on to that one. That's a really expensive one. But she gave it to me on loan last time I saw her. So this is a really fabulous book because that's literally what the whole premise of it is. It's the idea that we have the way in which he constructs the whole book in terms of the myth of Oedipus. Okay, and the Oedipus myth does bring up a certain point, because what happens is Oedipus gets a prophecy. His parents get the prophecy first. That's why he's going to kill his father, marry his mother, right? So they put him out in this field and they pin his legs. That's why he's called Oedipus, swollen foot, right? So then Shepherd feels sorry for him, doesn't want to kill him or expose him, so he takes him to the neighboring Corinth. It's from Thebes, takes him to Corinth. And so he is raised as the son of the king and queen of Corinth. But then at some point there's somebody, some drunken person at a party, in vino veritas, right, who says to him, "Oh, these aren't your real parents." And of course, he pays attention to that, and then his parents are like, "Oh, don't listen to him, he's drunk." But he goes to the oracle because now he's concerned about this. Oracle tells him the same thing: "You're going to kill your father, marry your mother." And he goes, "Oh, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to avoid that." So just as his parents tried to avoid the fate by having him out and leaving him to be exposed, so he's going to avoid his fate by leaving Corinth and getting on the road. And while he's on the road, there's like this case of chariot road rage or whatever. And the man he ends up killing, who, I don't know, like trying to push him off the road or something, he gets in a fight with him, kills him. Turns out it's King Laius, who is his father, who's the king of Thebes. So he's, number one, he's just killed his father. No idea that he's done it, but he's done it. He gets to Thebes, and he encounters the Sphinx. So Peter Redgrave, who is the author of this book, talks a lot about the riddle of the Sphinx. And while a lot of us just think that Oedipus is the big hero because he answered the Sphinx's riddle and she ran away because he had properly answered her riddle, there's some theories that she ran away because now he had decided that that the privileged answer to this was humans, and the Sphinx representing that kind of Chtonic power of the earth. It's sort of like, okay, it kind of abandons humans at that point. He kind of gets into the detail of this. But what happens is then he's welcomed into Thebes, and they say, oh, well, you're our hero, so you can have the queen as your wife. And queen happens to be his mother, and he doesn't know that. So he has unconsciously fulfilled this prophecy in his attempt to avoid it. But then when he realizes what he's done, he puts his eyes out. Okay, and he's blind. Now Oedipus is blind. Now, who else is blind? Well, Tiresias is blind, the prophet who, in Greek mythology, who is the unfortunate position of who has lived a life as both male and female through a myth that I'm not going to get into right now. But then Zeus and Hera, the king and queen of the gods, are having an argument, and they say to him, "You tell us who gets more pleasure in bed, the man or the woman." And Tiresias has to, because Hera's arguing that the man has more pleasure, and Zeus is arguing that it's the woman, and Tiresias ends up siding with Zeus, that the woman gets more pleasure, and Hera, of course, in a rage, makes him go blind. So Zeus kind of gives him a compensation by giving him the gift of prophecy. Well, prophecy goes with blindness because it's about seeing but not with your eyes. Okay? It's about knowing things without having to see them. If a person is blind and they're going through life, they can have a way where they can get around perfectly well, but they don't do it with vision. They do it with touch. They do it with other senses. They may have stronger hearing. They may have other kinds of sensitivities because they compensate for not having sight. So, but because we privilege sight and because we privilege mind so much, we don't have contact with these other senses. So when I talk about doing dark work, okay, the dark that you're working in is, these spaces where your eyes can't see. Something is definitely happening, and it's not something fake. That's the other thing, too. We've decided that if we can't see it with our own eyes, somehow it's not real. And that's sometimes true, but sometimes what you see with your own eyes is also not real. There's all kinds of things about, the kinds of confirmation bias and our perceptual fallacies that we have that anybody can tell you about that can also be in play here. Because, what you see may not be what's real. Okay, that can also happen. So... But nonetheless, our way of knowing things comes from that venue. Now, the other piece of this is, okay, so when we talk about this this darkness, okay, and I think, I had kind of a note to myself here. I said, there's other blind prophets too. Anchises, the father of Aeneas, Polymestor at the end of the play Hecuba, it's Hecuba, Euripides' play, where she's the queen of Troy. She sends her son away, her son Polydorus, but then the beginning of the play, the blood of her son is crying out from the ground because he's been killed. Now, he was sent away to live with somebody called Polymestor, who was supposed to, as an act of hospitality, was taking him, and she didn't want him to be involved in the war, so she had sent him away. But once Polymestor realized the Trojan War wasn't going so well, and Troy was probably going to be sacked and looted, he killed Polydorus and took his money, which is a gross violation of hospitality rules. So anyway, the women who are now slaves of the Greek, what we now call the Greek soldiers, the Achaean soldiers, when Polymestor comes to the camp to speak to the women, they all kind of hiding their needles, their sewing needles, or and they basically go and they jab his eyes out. And the Greek and the Achaean soldiers do not defend him, because when they find out that the women have done this because he violated hospitality rules, they're like, okay, we're out. We're not. You're paying for your own actions. Like, we're not getting involved in this. And so, but he immediately starts to prophesize because he no longer has sight. He now is able to. He actually is able to predict Hecuba's future. And so, yeah, so there's this ability to see. It's almost like seeing with the eyes of the dead, okay, when you're able to see in this way. But we don't privilege that kind of seeing. We act as though that's not a real thing. It's not reliable because I can't see it. Oh, sorry, can't see it, touch it. I can't put my hands on it. I can't test it in a laboratory. I can't, so therefore it's not real. And that's a problem that we have, because then we have this separation, and we're always continually in doubt about what's real and what's not real. Okay, so dark work is about not so much about, it's not a class on psychic development necessarily there, but it is about learning to trust that aspect of you, that connects you to the earth, that connects you to the natural world, that allows you to see things that other people miss because they're just so focused very narrowly on, what's in front of me, what I've been told, what people's narratives are. I focus really heavily on narratives with people, because I'm saying, when people get very stuck, they get into these mental traps where they say, well, I would love to change this, and this, or I would love to stop this or get rid of that, but this, whatever the follow-up is to that, whatever it is that they say. And so you have to say, okay, well, why is that your assumption? And again, it's not that people don't always have legit reasons for not being able to do things, but the question often becomes, we often make our decisions about things based on these kinds of unconscious mental assumptions that either we've been taught, or that we've grown up with. Maybe our families have taught them to us. Maybe that's what we've gotten in the world. But there's another real big teacher here that people pay attention to and privilege more than anything, really. If you want to get real, okay? If you want to have somebody who says things very, very logically and doesn't understand why people are illogical, it's because they don't recognize that the thing people privilege the most is experience. Okay, and that's another component of this. What is your experience? When I teach myth, I always talk about experience. Now, when I'm teaching mythology to undergraduates, they don't have a lot of experience. I mean, unless they're older students, they don't have experience usually. Now, you can have somebody who's an undergraduate who's had maybe a very, very difficult and trying kind of a life, where maybe they have, unfortunately, had more life experience than they should as somebody who is just really more of a younger adult, okay? It does happen, and unfortunately, nowadays it seems to happen more than ever. But, but nonetheless, you assume, even so, even if there's somebody who is, on the side of perhaps being, a little bit better in terms of their reading or their comprehension or their knowledge, there's still a limitation of experience there. To give an example, when I was in undergraduate, one of the majors that I had was English literature, and when I was in grad school, I also had a component. I mean, my doctorate is technically in literary studies, even though I've written more about the underworld. It's an interdisciplinary degree, so that's why it kind of brings in all these different components. But I think I've said this before, I'm a huge fan of poetry, and I'm a huge fan of what we thought of as 20th century poetry. They used to use the word contemporary. That doesn't really, it's not really contemporary anymore, but it's still within the last 100 years, let's say. And I like a lot of the confessional poets like Plath and Robert Lowell. You have Anne Sexton, people like that. I love non-confessional poets like Elizabeth Bishop. So I've studied a lot of these poets as an undergraduate. So if we go back to Sylvia Plath as an example, when I studied Sylvia Plath as an undergraduate, I really, really liked her poetry, and it resonated with me in a certain way when I took those classes and when I wrote papers for those classes and so forth. Now, when I studied Plath again as a doctoral student, I reread all those poems, and you have a completely different view and a completely different understanding of what all of it is. And a lot of this, for a lot of these works, not just, there's her in particular, but also, like I said, Elizabeth Bishop, some of these others, there was like a profound meaning in it that I did not see when I was, my 18, 19, 20. Because I didn't have, not because there's anything wrong with my intellect, but because I had no life experience. At that age, you just haven't lived long enough to see and experience stuff. And so you're going to look at things differently in different periods of your life. Probably 20 years from now, I'll go back and look at it and have yet still a different perspective on the stuff. But so it's hard when you're trying to teach something like myth to undergraduates, especially in its most profound sense. I was thinking about this too. I sort of have a theory that one of the draws to using AI, because one of the things that educators have a problem with is students who want to write all their papers using AI. They want to give up their creativity, is because they have grown up in a system that says that everything has to be done very, very fast. Technologically, we have moved very, very fast. I'm not a young person, but I'm also not like a hugely old person either. But I didn't have the internet really as a tool until I was in grad school for the first time. Okay? And so my whole undergraduate years, you went to the library and you wrote things out and you did things on the typewriter and you learned how to type and all that kind of stuff, and everything came from books. And now that's not the world that we live in. Although those skills, I would argue, are still actually quite useful to people, but that's not the world that we live in right now. So, but the students, because everything and the technology does change very, very fast. Even for a lot of them, the technology that existed when they were, say, in elementary school and now that they're in university, it can also be very, very different. But what happens is that also we've had an educational system, at least in the US, that is now so numbers obsessed. Anybody who works in education hears the word assessment far more than they want to. And I am so sick of assessment. I understand its value to a point, but when you have to take literally every concept that you teach and you have to parse it out and assign like a number to it to say, oh, this meets this task, this meets this goal. This is what K-12 teachers have to deal with. And at least in New Jersey, I'm not going to speak for other states, but I don't think it's limited to New Jersey. And it's ridiculous because you can't, you don't really have a freedom to teach the way you want to. And there's it's all about trying to reach a certain number kind of a goal. That's why standardized testing, which we've always had, all of a sudden is privileged to the point that now, and certainly when Chris Christie was governor of New Jersey, and I don't know if it's changed under the current governor, but it was, there was this thing of teachers' raises and such were tied to test scores, which was, if Chris Christie understood anything at all about numbers, would realize that's absolutely absurd. You can't do that because the way the tests are scored, it's been explained before, but basically students would have to get more points than are available on the test for the teacher to be able to get a perfect score. And I'm not going to get into the maths of that, but so teachers in short started teaching to tests. Anything, and you have to hurry up because the test covers all these things and we have to make sure we're covering all these things. And so things that take time, research skills, language arts skills, critical thinking skills, go by the wayside because we don't really have time for that. So then they get to university and they get to a class like mine where I'm like, okay, I need you to think about this in a way that's not just, I'm just writing down, here's the names of the 12 Olympians. I mean, yes, there's a certain level of that because the university requires that, they should be able to walk out of here and name this, this, and this. There's still an element of that. But that's not what the whole class is about. So the pieces where they have to think, it's like I have to explain to them every single time. No, I don't want you Googling the answer. I don't want you throwing it into ChatGPT. I know when you're doing that because that's not you talking. I want to hear about you because this material ultimately connects to you. And and I realize it's not going to connect to them in a profound way. They just haven't been alive long enough for that. But, and some people, like I know my coordinator, Glenn Gill, he's the coordinator of the Myth department at Montclair State. And at one time we were reviewing the materials that I was doing with my class. And at one point I was using part of Neumann's work, Eric Neumann's work, The Great Mother. And he's like, these are freshmen and sophomores. Like, what are they? She's like, you think they're going to have any understanding of Neumann? And they weren't reading all of Neumann, by the way. It was just like an excerpt to a particular class. And my answer to that really, to his point, yeah, he's right. A lot of them don't understand Neumann. But to his point, I was just kind of like, yeah, but I still want them to grapple with the material. And this is what I mean also about dark work. I want you to grapple with the material. people are very uncomfortable grappling with that material when you start getting into a certain depth, okay? And dealing with the dark is dealing with the depths, right? When you start moving into those deeper spots, you have a lot of people who just, they freak out because, first of all, it's something that they don't know. Even if they read some of these stories or learned things, it's not what they know. And students today, and it's not just on my undergrads, but there's people, they're not comfortable with what they don't know. And I guess nobody is, to be fair. I mean, if somebody asked me to give a dissertation on quantum physics, I'd be like, what I could say about it would be very, very limited. And they're like, yeah, I'm not sure I'm the person you want to ask. But if you're kind of thrown in and have to grapple with a particular concept, you might do it well, you might not. But I always feel like it's better to wrestle with the hard material, but a lot of people don't like to do that. They want a very simple answer to something. And so therefore they're saying, okay, I don't think I'm clever enough to come up with an answer, and it's taking too much time, so I'm just going to throw something in and output something that I think the professor will like. And I said, no, don't do that. With their weekly assignments, I said, even if you're late, even if you need to take an extra day to think about it, I want you to listen to what I'm saying, and I want your interpretation. I said, if you're wrong, I'll tell you that you're not quite getting it. But you're not going to get a bad score because you got it wrong. We don't like to make mistakes today. It's just like, oh, you can't do that. And that's why we have all of these things that are, to correct everything that we're doing. We have all kinds of programs and things to correct every aspect of ourselves and of our creativity and everything else. And I'm like, no, that's because, number one, we believe we can't get it wrong. We can't fail. We can't make mistakes. We can't, and we don't want to delve into areas that are unfamiliar to us or potentially uncomfortable. That was always my joke. People would say like, well, say to me, well, why are you single? And I'd be like, look, try walking into a bar and sitting there, and if people ask you what you do, you say, yeah, well, I deal in death studies, and just watch people kind of move away. Nobody wants to talk about this stuff, okay? Or very few people do. But to me, that's why I work with the people I work with. I kind of specifically not target, but my audience, my desired audience, I guess you could call it, would be people who are in transition. Because as I was explaining to somebody recently, I was having a back and forth conversation with somebody who was talking about myth and saying, oh, well, it's just a bunch of old beliefs that people had. And I was like, no, that's not what myth is. But the more I was trying to sort of explain it, this person, I could tell as I was explaining it to them, they were finally just like, well, you know what? And a lot of people have heard this too. I think you just need to be a good person. You'll hear that as kind of the default. This subject is well beyond where I want to go, and that's just how that's my narrative. I just try to be a good person. And I kind of said, yeah, okay. Yeah, sure, be a good person, of course, because we're all doing our best to live lives the way we think is decent, ethical, but whatever, in terms of whatever that is for us, for the most part. But the bottom line is, okay, but when what happens when things fall apart? Because inevitably you're not going to live through an entire lifespan and not have something fall apart. Or maybe if you're lucky enough to go through a whole life with nothing falling apart, you're going to die at some point, right? What do we deal with when we're always going to encounter change? If we don't encounter change, something's probably not right. Okay? If you have a whole life where everything is the same, I also don't think people would be happy with a life like that. That's why we have these elements of people who are dissatisfied with, when they have a lot of things, because people always want to be kind of striving for something, or they feel like that there has to be some level of conflict there, because if there's not something that you're negotiating at times, if you're not working through things, if it's just you wake up every day and everything's perfect and you never are challenged on anything, I mean, it gets really dull really quick. But even just from the dullness factor, I mean, that's just not how life is. And I think it was Campbell who had said, if you find that everything in your life is going from A to B to C, and you're not having any, and there's no challenge, it's just, oh, okay, I finished this, and then this happened, and then this happened, and everything went along smoothly with no bumps, no anything, he said, then probably you're living somebody else's life. And what he means by that is that somebody else has probably stepped in, taken control, and decided, you're the pawn that they're kind of moving from A to B to C. You're not living your own life. And that's the other piece of the dark work. what's authentic to you. A lot of times we don't deal with what's authentic to ourselves because we believe that we are somehow because it's like the students I have, for instance, in religious studies. If they really enjoy the topic, and by the way, I don't teach theology, I don't teach world religions per se, I teach about religion in a broader structure. Why do we have myths? Why do we have rituals? Why do we have scriptures? Why do we have that level of religion? And they may say, wow, this is really interesting and this is a subject I'd want to study, but it doesn't really make me any money and my parents want me to take accounting, so that's what I'm doing. And of course, because the parents are paying for the education, then they say, well, you're going to take what we tell you to take, right? I mean, that's just one example. But frequently we will do things because to be fair, we have to survive. We make decisions in our lives based on, okay, what is my profession going to be? How am I going to make a living? How am I going to do that? But we're also living in a time when people are challenging what it means to do that. There's more people who are saying, well, no, there are other ways to work now, where I don't have to, get a 9-to-5 job and do that every day. I think this was a conversation I had with my mother last week. My mother, I cannot get through a phone conversation with her without her asking me, like, well, are you making enough money doing what you're doing? And I'm like, I'm still here. I'm still paying my mortgage. I still live here. I'm still making it happen. I'm still figuring it out. And it's not always the same way every month, the way that I figure it out, but I figure it out. But she says to me, well, you have to understand, for me, the only way you're going to do that is if you have a 9-to-5 job that you go to every day. I said, well, yeah. I said, that was great back in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s when you actually used to work before you became a full-time housewife. And then she worked part-time for a number of years. But I said, yeah, that worked for you. I said, that's fine, but that was your life. I said, and how old are you? I said, you're going to be 87. I mean, you're not, this is a different world. That's not the way people necessarily do things now. But then we often get tied to things, or we say we know we have changed. We know that something is different. We are not where we were before. We can't go back to where we were before, but we keep trying to do the same things from before and get frustrated because they're not working for us right now. And it's like, well, that's because you have to keep moving through. You have to accept the death, so to speak. You have to do something differently. You can't do it the new way. But oftentimes people don't know what the new way is yet. It's not that they're not necessarily willing to embrace a new way. They just like, well, I don't know what it is. I don't know how to figure it out. It's sometimes more overwhelming than that. It's easier to go back and do it the old way, as unsatisfactory as that may be, or as inauthentic as that may be. We take the path of least resistance, right? But dark work, as I like to call it, is about kind of going into those deeper spaces. And I would argue, especially in today's world, with the way things are changing, with the kinds of uncertainties and anxieties and traumas that people tend to deal with on a regular basis, that it's actually to your benefit to do this kind of work. It's to your benefit to get in touch with these kinds of narratives. And the way that I do that is in a couple of ways. I feel like I am here to get beyond the intellect. I'm here, obviously there's an intellectual component to this. This is how you interface, right? But you have to get into the symbolism. It's like a vehicle for interpreting that symbolism. That is what I'm trying to provide here. Dreams are a big thing, like for me. When I'm working with clients, it's kind of like, okay, well, I want to look at your dreams and your dream symbolism, because a lot of people don't know what those what they mean. And so, and even in teaching mythology and in teaching or talking about dark feminine figures, I'm saying let's look at what the story is surrounding this, because those are the things that resonate with people. It's like, where does this fit into the story? Where does this fit into my story? What are these symbols saying about my life or about where I'm going? And it may not always be in a very superficial way. Usually it's in a much more profound way. We may start looking at things in a very superficial way, but it starts to become part of the process of profound transformation, which is not something you can do through positive affirmations and through just I'm just going to do positive thinking and clean eating. I mean, yeah, you can do those things. There's nothing wrong with doing those things if you want to, but that's not going to scratch it. It reminds me, I had a coworker once. Actually, I was in charge of the department, and she was somebody who worked under me, whose office was an absolute disaster zone. Okay, she had papers piled everywhere, and she shared an office with another person, and he was like, I am so sick of this and sharing this office and being in this mess, because that person was very minimalist. They only wanted like 2 things on their desk. So finally I decided I was going to move this person out of that office. And I said to her, you've got to clean this office out. And so what she would do, she had, like I said, if you look at the room, it was like piled with papers. She picked up 2 sheets of paper, she put it in recycling, and she goes, oh yeah, that felt good to clean. I'm like, clean what? You didn't clean anything. And that's kind of the way I see a lot of that stuff. It's like, okay, yeah, you've done a little bit of something, but you've barely gotten started here. A lot of times these kinds of rituals and affirmations and things, this is just the starting point. This is not the ending point. So I was like, it's funny, I kind of feel like I'm going full circle here from where I started. But yeah, that's not the ending point. And the work is very profound, but I find that I tend to agree with James Hillman that a lot of this work is a lot done for people who are not engaged in ritual systems where they're undergoing initiations and things, which is not for everybody. Maybe a lot of people who do follow this channel are also part of that kind of a system, so they understand that and the value of that. Or systems like Tantra, which has to do with the alchemy of taking the raw material of everything and turning it into a kind of gold, figuratively speaking. How is gold made? I mean, it's when you talk about the idea of doing that, it's often made, one of the base ingredients has to do with shit, basically. When you think about how fields are often fertilized, they often use manure, right? It's the idea that out of this filthy material, like, something good arises. There's some treasure to be found. Where do we find wealth? We find it in the depths. You don't, Pluton. That's the word. You find it in the depths. That's where you find your gold and your silver and your precious gems. They're all in the ground. Okay, so that's the idea, is that you are getting back to that not only through learning about how to use your other senses, but oftentimes by using bridges that might be verbal, but also potentially nonverbal. So art, music, other kinds of things that where you're working more in image or in sound, or something that gets you out of the space of trying to rationalize and dissect. There's always going to be a certain amount of that we do, because that's the way that we're geared. But it's a question of how do you get beyond that, and how do you get to the experience. But this is something, even as somebody who is a coach or a mediator or a mentor to somebody, I said, I can't do this work for you. I can point you to where you might want to go and might want to look based on what's happening to you already. And based on what I usually do with people is what they call a life assessment, where I go through and I look at all of the astrology, both Western and Eastern. I look at the human design information. I do use tarot and stuff like that, because to me that's a symbolic language. It's talking in symbols. It's not talking in words. And it may be translated that way because that's the way we communicate and we understand. But there are other ways of communicating and understanding. And sometimes when people encounter that stuff, especially if people encounter what I will call the numinous. I had a dream last night, which I'm not going to get into the details of, but I have been doing a whole lot of what I'm going to call death work. When I say that, I'm talking about literally working kind of with forces of death, for which I feel that some of my work has to do with channeling that kind of information, or channeling that kind of force, or that kind of transitional thing. And I had a dream last night that, again, the details aren't so important, except that in the dream I woke up, I left a room to go to another room, and I encountered something like my initial reaction to it was absolute fear. Okay, it was absolute fear. And, but I also reminded myself, the point here is not to be afraid. This is something other, but this is what you need to speak to, or what wants to use you to speak through. So I became very aware of that in the dream and was able to act accordingly. But yeah, but oftentimes when people encounter something like that that's very different or other, and it doesn't have to be necessarily connected. The numinous is just that which is very alien to us in our experience, and people often perceive things like that as threatening. When you encounter something numinous, people will think they've encountered evil. And it's like, no, you haven't necessarily encountered evil. I mean, you're encountering something you don't want to muck with necessarily, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. It just means it's something that feels so alien to you that you, and because you don't have a reference point for it, we automatically take things that we don't have a reference point for and call them evil. And that's the whole point. That's but probably the final piece I'm trying to get to is that no, that's not material you want to avoid. Yes, it can be scary, and it doesn't mean you always have to jump into terrible, scary situations. Obviously, that's not, we're not trying to traumatize people either. But there is a certain amount of that where it's just kind of like, no, if you would just stop and look, you realize that this is actually something that is trying to help you move to the next step, not something that's trying to scare you or attack you or destroy you in some way that is it's final to your being, where your instinct kicks in to fight back, your fight or flight instinct. How do you work with that kind of material? And as I've said, I don't have a 5-step plan for that kind of a thing. Basically, the best thing I can do is I say, you educate people on the symbols, you educate people on what they're, to what degree you can, on what they're experiencing, and also to validate people's experience. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there today, but a lot of it just comes out of fear and out of people trying to make sense of certain experiences. So it's a matter of trying to let people understand, okay, you don't have to interpret things according to this, does this fall into the good bucket or the bad bucket kind of experience. Don't get yourself caught up in that, because then you're more easily caught up in fear, and you're not able to negotiate, roll with, or move through change. And that's when it actually has the power to either take you over. What was it? It was a C.S. Lewis phrase that he said, in the Screw Tape Letters, he says, the one thing the devil wants you to believe is that he doesn't exist. And that's often been interpreted by clergy that I've met in very different ways. But I said, no, it's the idea that, when you think you are safe from the devil, all it means is that you're repressing whatever that is that you associate with the devil, and you just project it out onto everybody else. And therefore you do more damage that way because you are so unaware. So a lot of different moving pieces to it. Ultimately, when I work one-on-one with people on this kind of stuff, they have to figure out. Ultimately, you can't make somebody's journey for them. All you can do is point people in the direction and try to give them the information that they need to maybe understand what's happening. But ultimately, the experience itself is the thing. And we don't want to discount those experiences. We're often taught to discount experience because, because it's not rational or it's not sensible or whatever. It's like, but that experience doesn't have anything to do with that space. And if it's a really profound transformational experience, it's going to be outside of that space. And you're not necessarily going to be able to understand it in that way. I guess what I'll finish up with, because we are about 10 after 1, I'm running over here. When I went back to the idea of the bioluminescence again, I think of the tarot card of the moon. And the thing about the moon and the moon energy is it's more what's known from what's intuited and felt, because the facts of something are not clear. They're clouded. And a lot of people sometimes interpret that card in a very negative way because they say, you're not able to directly really see what's going on. It's like, no, but it's more about what you can see in the dark. What kind of vision you have for what you can see when you don't have the light to see, when you don't have the vision, when your rational faculties only go so far. So how well do you flow with what's coming next? And how well are you able to discriminate? And again, I'm using the term discrimination, meaning sorting between what's the appropriate thing to do in a situation and what's not, or whether or not your interpretation of something is correct or not. how do you make that distinction? That's where the educational piece comes in. So anyway, I probably could say a whole lot more on the subject. Thank you guys so much for watching today. I really appreciate everybody who joins in on these live streams. As I mentioned, I'm going to save this to Instagram, and it'll be there. Yeah, sometimes it doesn't play the full thing in post, so just hit it again and watch it in Reels, and then you can see the whole thing if you want a whole playback. And also, I am going to upload this tomorrow to YouTube. So I want to say thank you very much, everybody who I see in the live chat room for joining me this week. And I will be here again next Monday, and I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. So, and leave me comments if you would like. So, take care.